much more work, 10 to the 40th power times more work in the same period of time with that force. Now that's a free energy idea, because if you take a weak force and convert it to that stronger force, you can do a lot more work than you could as a weak force. So you can take gravitational energy, convert it into electrical energy, and do 10 to the 40th times more work with it.
It would seem obvious why certain energy cartels wouldn't want that kind of information floating around.
It will destroy them when it gets out, and it will.
Yeah, I'd like to talk further on some more free energy ideas. Just to finish up with, actually I want to ask you about Kenneth Arnold and his sightings, but initially what is interesting about this flying submarine business is Kenneth Arnold had some interesting comments to make about some flying saucers that were appearing here in America. Arnold insisted nevertheless that Morella bring him up to date, finally settled for a written account for which he apparently was interviewing a lot of witnesses. At this time, the West Coast was experiencing a siege of reports about mysterious submarines operating off United States coastlines. Arnold told Klein he is convinced there is a definite link between the saucers and the submarines. There you go. He makes a reference to submarines and UFOs, which I
and
find
notice
an
he's
interesting
subjected to
coincidence.
press ridicule. That's interesting, see?
Yeah, why would that be?
If the government didn't know what it was, they would be the first to be there to interrogate Arnold to find out what it was. If they didn't know what it was, they would certainly be interested, and they certainly wouldn't want to ridicule somebody that they would like to debrief. I mean, that tells you right there. Now, what I'm saying is in the stalemate, they worked out certain conditions where the Germans continued to cooperate through the United States government in this stuff, and so the continuity wasn't broken between the German projects and the American projects. They brought 15,000 personnel to New Mexico with that, along with, there were 116 top scientists taken to Alamogordo, for example, and one of them was the one that tested the Lafrance project in the Baltic, the first firing of a rocket from underwater in one of these little Lafrance subs. And
Gee, where have we heard about that before?
Yeah. And
also, if we reference back to Kenneth Arnold's very famous sighting, which started the whole UFO craze in 1947. Right here we have his quote: "This very bright flash, like an arc light, was coming from a group of objects far up to the north of Mount Rainier in the area of Mount Baker, which is almost in line with Mount Rainier and Mount Adams. I saw a chain of peculiar aircraft approaching Mount Rainier very rapidly. They seemed to fly in an echelon formation. However, in looking at them against the sky and against the snow of Mount Rainier as they approached, I just couldn't discern any tails on them. And I had never seen an aircraft without a tail. These were fairly large-sized, and there were 9 of them." Like an arc lamp is an interesting reference.
That's Boeing territory, by the way. That's all the German scientists that worked out the contracts with Boeing aircraft were building American prototypes up there already by 1947.
Huh. Well, again, that's quite a coincidence. Here we have a picture of Kenneth Arnold himself holding up an interesting photograph of his flying saucer.
That's a drawing of the kind he saw?
Yes.
That looks a lot like a Horton flying wing.
Well, that's that's interesting you should mention that, because we have a picture of a Horton flying wing, so that we can make a comparison.
Yeah.
Gee.
Yeah.
You think that's what he saw?
But you see, that's the reason I think that there's a possibility that maybe Kenneth Arnold might be guilty of disinformation.
So
because
you
you
feel...
see jet engines, you see.
Sure.
That's not a flying saucer if you've got jet engines on it. See, it's
well, the
electrically
interesting
powered.
reference I'd like you to comment on is his remark about the blue light like an arc lamp. Do you feel that maybe he did see something, and that they were using something in addition to just jet
turbojets on the back there?
They might have been trying to develop some sort of hybrid technology where they could see. One of the problems with some of these saucers is getting them off the ground, because what happens is the electrical energy tends to arc to the ground a lot of times, so they've got to get them up in the air somehow before they take off. And they've used various kinds of rocket and jet power sometimes to get them off the ground.
You mentioned that in respect to Lonnie Zamora's sighting.
And that's what they observed there, was these blue, what looked like maybe something like ion jets or something. You see, chemical rockets that were to get it up off the ground so they could kick in the electric power. That way they didn't need so much in the way of landing gear. If they could, if they could soften the landing on these things and the takeoffs, then they just needed some little pods that came out to land on.
Here's a photograph of his original sketch. Shows a wedge-type or heel-shaped craft. And here's an early photograph of, again, a heel-shaped craft. This looks like it has some kind of glow to it. Your comments?
Yeah, I think they were experimenting around with different shapes. Basically, I think it all has boiled down to what you might call the lenticular and the linear. Well, the lenticular type is a linear type, and the circular type. Basically, the ship that I saw at Los Alamos, at Hyde Park above Santa Fe, it was a huge lenticle, you see. It was a huge lozenge shape. And you think about that, it was as big as a football field with the track around it. 5-story building, 50 feet thick. I'm going on proportion because I worked with proportion as a sculptor and a painter, so I can calculate proportional shape and size and so forth pretty well. And this thing would be like a flying 5-story building as big as that shape inside a football field and a track. Now that's a huge ship.
That is huge.
And what are they going to do with this ship? Now, the big question of me is, how are they hiding these things?
Where are they hiding?
And I have heard all kinds of scenarios from reliable people, people who know about such landing schemes in places like Switzerland, where they have whole cliffs or whole mountainsides that slide out, and the ship goes inside, and then the whole mountain closes back up.
You're saying people might have seen something like this?
Yes, I know people that have seen stuff like this, and I also know that there are people who have seen these things go into water. So what would be better than to have a lake just as a landing pad for this ship that goes underwater, and then there's a dolly down there that pulls it sideways into a place up the hill that's out of the water, or through an airlock.
In fact, there have been several sightings in Puerto Rico, in lagoons out there in Puerto Rico, and to make it even more convenient, these are held by the United States as wetlands, so that there's no human contact on these things, and these Puerto Ricans, these poor people, are seeing these lights going into the water over there. So that seems to be another cozy aspect of keeping this international biosphere program going on, is that you can do anything with the land that you want, including landing football-sized flying saucers under the water.
Well, all you need is unlimited funds, and and you've got it.
Yes. Who do we know that has unlimited funds?
Anything. You see, my theory is, this is the only thing that's theoretical that I'm saying, is, why have they kept it secret so long? And my theory is the big corporations don't want us to have this technology, because when you start making a list of everything that this thing is going to obsolesce, it's a lot.
It's a big
transportation, fuel, all kinds of things. Aeronautical companies, airlines, you name it. Spare parts. There's not a lot to wear out.
And who runs the airlines? The CIA?
Yeah.
You're going to put them out of business?
When you start looking at that, it's my opinion that the only reason the military even is allowed to use this technology is so that they can argue that it's a national security interest to be protected and use the government to protect the technology from us. In other words, to keep us from, not talking about the Russians or Chinese, their governments have this same technology. The only reason they keep it secret is to keep us, the citizens who pay for it, from finding out how and using it.
Right.
And so here's the government telling these outrageous lies to every child in America, every adult in America, and every old person in America about aliens. They've concocted this whole thing, and an intelligence network distributed it through
making sure that we're dumbed down enough to where a lot of people would actually buy that.
Yeah, I'm not surprised at this recent scandal that they dug up about the dumbness of the school books they're writing.
Huh.
You know, that's no surprise to me.
No, of course not.
And,
actually, that's been an ever-present dream of certain groups in our society for over 100 years.
They've been stealing and hiding technology for so long. They don't want it to move any faster. They want it to move real slow.
Sure.
Because they've got all the technology they want us to have, and they want to keep it moving slow because they've got all that oil to sell us, and they're jacking up the prices whenever they think they can get away with it.
Sure.
And they know that every time they jack up the prices, though, it stimulates vapor carburetor research, and so they can only jack the price up for a while, and then they have to drop it back down again to kill the research. You see.
Then people forget about that. To give you an idea of what we were capable of in 1947, referring once again back to Kenneth Arnold's sighting, on the way he made some rough calculations of the speed of the formation from the timing he had done near Mount Rainier. He came up with an answer of around 1,700 miles an hour in 1947.
That could be the Horton jets, you see.
Do you think that they would achieve that kind of speed?
Yeah, I think they could have. You know, you never know how fast a plane goes. You can never rely on any published information about its speed. I mean, if you look at an old Jane's manual, you'll see that in many cases the top speed of the aircraft and all the other characteristics are classified, still classified at certain times. So they usually won't even tell you, and if they do tell you, you can't really know whether it's true or not. You know, it could be much faster.
Sure.
But you know, you never really know what the top speed of an aircraft is because usually they won't even publish it. They'll show the picture of it in the manual, but they won't tell you how fast its climb rate is and so forth. Its performance characteristics may be classified, but I believe they could have gotten, with some of those Horton planes, they could have gotten close to that. From what I saw, the pictures of these things, those are pretty advanced designs. What they do is they don't want this technology to go too fast. So they get a lead and they just want it to go with a certain speed as long as they're faster than the Russian planes or whatever.
Right.
And,
as long as, just to keep that edge.
Meanwhile, they're going 25,000 miles an hour, like the one I saw in 1953. And then they're talking, they've got articles all out there in the papers that they're controlling, talking about how we might be on the verge of discovering anti-gravity technology.
Yeah,
you know?
I suppose our old friend Murabo will figure that one out for us, too.
I'd like to thank Mr. Lyne for being our guest on the 33rd Parallel. I hope there are many who feel as I do, that it's a good and healthy thing to entertain alternative views on items of such importance as our world history and scientific progress. This is, in fact, the primary objective of this video series. I hope you found it worthwhile, and remember, the truth can flow from lies, but lies cannot flow from the truth. Good night.
About some flying saucers that were appearing here in America. Arnold insisted nevertheless that Morella bring him up to date, finally settled for a written account for which he apparently was interviewing a lot of witnesses. At this time, the West Coast was experiencing a siege of reports about mysterious submarines operating off United States coastlines.
Much more work, 10 to the 40th power times more work in the same period of time with that force. Now that's a free energy idea, because if you take a weak force and convert it to that stronger force, you can do a lot more work than you could as a weak force. So you can take gravitational energy, convert it into electrical energy, and do 10 to the 40th times more work with
It would
it.
seem obvious why certain energy cartels wouldn't want that kind of information floating around.
They wouldn't want to ridicule somebody that they would like to debrief. I mean, that tells you right there. Now, what I'm saying is in the stalemate, they worked out certain conditions where the Germans continued to cooperate through the United States government in this stuff, and so the continuity wasn't broken between the German projects and the American projects. They brought 15,000.
Arnold told Klein he is convinced there is a definite link between the saucers and the submarines. There you go. He makes a reference to submarines and UFOs, which I
And
find an
notice he
interesting
subjected to
coincidence.
press ridicule. That's interesting, see?
Yeah, why would that
If
be?
the government didn't know what it was, they would be the first to be there to interrogate Arnold to find out what it was. If they didn't know what it was, they would certainly be interested, and they certainly, it will destroy them when it gets out, and it will.
Yeah, I'd like to talk further on some more free energy ideas.
Just to finish up with, actually, I want to ask you about Kenneth Arnold and his sightings, but initially what is interesting about this flying submarine business is Kenneth Arnold had some interesting comments to make